Your great-grandfather didn't just change his name to sound more American. That story you've been told, the one about Ellis Island clerks scribbling down whatever they heard, the one about making life easier in a new country, it's a cover. Not the harmless kind of family mythology that gets passed down through generations. The kind that was designed to make you stop asking questions. Because what if the real reason had nothing to do with fitting in? What if it had everything to do with erasing a connection to something that powerful people needed the world to forget? Let me show you what's been hiding in plain sight. In archives across Europe and America, there's a pattern. Families with surnames tied to specific regions of Central Asia, surnames with linguistic roots in Turkic and Mongolic languages, surnames that trace back to the vast territories once labelled on every map as Tartary. These names started disappearing in mass numbers between 1850 and 1920, and not gradually, all at once. And the official explanation has always been simple: immigration, assimilation, progress, but the timing is too precise, the scale is too coordinated, and the geography is too specific. Tartary wasn't a myth. It was a recognised territory spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the borders of Persia to the edges of Siberia. It appeared on maps for 6 centuries. European cartographers labelled it with the same certainty they labelled France or Spain. Encyclopedias described it, travellers documented it, diplomatic records referenced it. Then, sometime in the mid-1800s, it began to vanish from official records. Not because borders changed, because the entire concept was systematically removed from historical documentation. Maps were redrawn. Encyclopedia entries disappeared in later editions. References in government archives became vague or were reclassified. By 1900, Tartary had been replaced with a patchwork of smaller regional names, each one obscuring the unified civilization that once existed there. And as the maps changed, so did the names of the people who could trace their heritage back to those territories. The Ellis Island story is where most people stop digging. It's comforting, it makes sense. Your ancestor arrived, couldn't communicate properly, and a clerk wrote down something phonetically close. End of story. Except that's not how Ellis Island actually worked. The clerks didn't write down names. They worked from manifests created by shipping companies before departure. These documents were filled out in the immigrant's home country, usually by someone who spoke their language, a Saf. When families arrived at Ellis Island, inspectors checked them against pre-existing lists. The rules explicitly stated that names could not be changed unless the immigrant requested it, or there was a clear error in the original documentation. 1/3 of Ellis Island inspectors were foreign-born themselves. They spoke an average of 3 languages each. Professional interpreters were available for obscure dialects. The infrastructure existed to preserve names accurately. So why did so many change anyway? Because the changes weren't happening at Ellis Island. They were happening 5 years later. During naturalisation, that's when immigrants legally adopted new surnames, and it's when the paper trail gets deliberately murky. Before 1906, there was no requirement to document name changes during the citizenship process. Genealogists trying to trace original surnames hit a wall at this exact point in the records. Not because the documents were lost, because they were never created in the first place. The patterns in these changes reveal something deliberate. Families didn't just simplify their names, they erased specific linguistic markers. Surnames with Turkic roots became generically European. Names indicating geographic origins in Central Asia became unrecognisable. And in many cases, multiple unrelated families adopted identical new surnames, almost as if they were following instructions from a standardised list. You see this in Russian immigration records, in German documentation of displaced peoples, in Austrian archives of families moving west, the same clusters of original surnames vanishing and being replaced by the same small pool of new ones. Statistically, it doesn't make sense unless there was coordination, unless someone was providing guidance on which names were acceptable and which needed to be abandoned. Then there's the architecture, because while the names were being erased, so was the physical evidence. Buildings across Europe and America from the 1700s and 1800s feature construction techniques that don't match the documented technology of their supposed builders. Precision stonework requiring tools that didn't officially exist. Load-bearing calculations that shouldn't have been possible without modern engineering knowledge. Doorways and halls scaled for people significantly larger than average human height. These structures cluster in regions that once fell under the designation of Tartary, or were built by populations with documented migration from those territories. And starting in the late 1800s, many of these buildings were systematically demolished. Not because they were unsafe, not because they were outdated, but because their existence raised questions about who actually built them and when. The 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco showcased temporary buildings of extraordinary architectural sophistication. After the fair, they were demolished instead of preserved. The original Pennsylvania Station in New York, a structure of almost impossible engineering precision, was torn down in 1963. The Singer Building, once the tallest in the world, demolished in 1968. In every case, the official explanation focused on progress and modernization. But what if the real reason was that these buildings were never temporary at all? What if they were remnants of something older? Something inherited, something that told a story about who built this infrastructure and when they actually lived here. And what if your family name was one of the linguistic breadcrumbs connecting you back to the people who knew? The coordination becomes visible when you examine naturalization records from different cities during the same time period. Families arriving from regions once labelled as Tartary on old maps adopted surnames that cluster around specific patterns, not random anglicizations, deliberate selections that severed linguistic connections to their origins. In Chicago, between 1890 and 1910, over 300 families with surnames containing Turkic or Central Asian root words changed to variations of Schmidt, Müller, or Wagner. In New York during the same period, similar patterns emerged with Johnson, Anderson, and Peterson. These weren't organic choices reflecting personal preference. They were systematic replacements following an invisible template. Employment records tell the same story. Factory hiring logs show workers listing one surname on their initial application, then appearing in payroll documentation 6 months later under completely different names. No legal paperwork, no court filings. Just administrative changes that happened during the probationary period. And here's what makes it suspicious. The workers who kept their original surnames, those with clearly Slavic or Germanic roots, had no employment issues. But anyone whose name suggested origins further east faced consistent rejection until they adopted something more acceptable. The pressure wasn't explicit, it was atmospheric, a quiet understanding that certain backgrounds needed to be obscured for economic survival. This wasn't limited to America. German municipal records from the 1880s show similar patterns. Families relocating from eastern territories systematically adopting surnames that removed geographic identifiers. Russian archives document the same phenomenon in reverse, people moving west shedding names that connected them to regions no longer appearing on updated maps. Why would populations across multiple countries independently decide to erase the same linguistic markers during the same narrow window of time? Unless they were responding to something larger, a cultural shift that made certain origins unacceptable, a rewriting of acceptable heritage that required individuals to participate in their own erasure. The architectural evidence amplifies this pattern, because while families were changing their names, their former homelands were being systematically demolished or repurposed. Buildings throughout Central Asia, structures that appeared on 18th century maps as major urban centres, were either destroyed or reclassified as ancient ruins with fabricated histories. Photographs from the 1860s show intact cities with sophisticated infrastructure. Aqueducts, administrative buildings, residential complexes, all suggesting organised urban planning. Then by the 1890s, those same locations appear in documentation as archaeological sites, ancient remnants of unnamed civilizations, their actual construction dates conveniently lost to history. The world's fairs of the late 1800s and early 1900s displayed this most blatantly. Temporary buildings of extraordinary architectural sophistication, structures that supposedly took months to construct, featured stonework precision that modern engineers still can't fully explain. And after each fair, immediate demolition, no preservation, no adaptive reuse, just systematic destruction of evidence. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair showcased over 200 buildings of neoclassical design. The official story claims they were temporary plaster constructions, but photographs reveal stone foundations, complex electrical systems, and architectural details requiring years of skilled craftsmanship. 6 months after the fair closed, nearly everything was demolished. The official explanation cited fire danger and structural instability. But the buildings that survived, the ones repurposed as museums, remain structurally sound over a century later. San Francisco's 1915 exposition followed an identical pattern. Grand structures built in months, demolished within a year. The Palace of Fine Arts, the single building preserved, required such extensive reinforcement during its conversion to permanent status that engineers openly questioned how it had stood at all if constructed as temporary plaster. And the timing aligns perfectly. These fairs occurred during the exact decades when Tartary disappeared from maps, when surname changes peaked, when giant skeleton discoveries filled newspaper columns, then suddenly stopped. Everything converging in a 30-year window between 1880 and 1910. What changed during that period? Photography became widespread enough to create permanent documentation, but not yet sophisticated enough to easily verify or falsify images. Maps transitioned from artistic interpretations to standardized geographic surveys, but the process allowed for selective updating of territorial boundaries and place names. Historical records began centralization into national archives, but with enough discretion over what got included and what got quietly misfiled. It was the perfect moment for controlled revision. Documentation existed but remained malleable. Evidence could be preserved selectively while uncomfortable details disappeared into administrative reorganization. The construction techniques themselves tell a deeper story. Buildings from the Tartarian period, those labelled as such on pre-1850 maps, share specific characteristics regardless of geographic location. Modular stone cutting, precision joinery without mortar, acoustic properties suggesting intentional sound engineering, and most notably doorways and corridors scaled for individuals significantly taller than average human height. This isn't speculation. Measurements from surviving structures in Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and remote Russian territories consistently show architectural proportions designed for people 8 to 10 feet tall. Not ceremonial spaces, working buildings with practical layouts that make no sense unless the occupants match those dimensions. And those proportions appear in buildings across America and Europe from the same era. Government structures, railway stations, administrative centres, all featuring the same oversized dimensions officially explained as aesthetic grandeur. But grandeur doesn't require 12-foot ceilings in storage rooms. It doesn't demand staircases with risers so tall they're uncomfortable for normal-sized people to climb. Unless the architects were copying something, inheriting a design language from structures they found already built, adapting spaces created for different occupants into facilities for a smaller population. That inheritance becomes obvious when you examine construction records. Buildings officially dated to the 1870s contained foundation stones with weathering patterns suggesting centuries of exposure. Structures attributed to 19th century architects incorporate engineering principles that weren't formally documented until decades after their supposed construction. The evidence points toward a civilization displaced, its population scattered, its identity systematically erased. And your family name might be the last remaining clue connecting you to what was deliberately forgotten. The surname changes themselves reveal the clearest pattern. Between 1880 and 1920, immigration records show an extraordinary spike in voluntary name modifications. Not at Ellis Island, that's a persistent myth. The changes happened afterward, during naturalization, during employment applications, during the quiet administrative moments when someone decided their identity needed adjustment. Official explanations cite practical concerns, Americanization, economic opportunity, avoiding discrimination, all legitimate reasons that conveniently obscure a deeper possibility. What if some families weren't simplifying foreign names? What if they were severing connections to a heritage that had become dangerous to acknowledge? Census records from this period contain peculiar annotations. Families with surnames appearing on pre-1850 Tartary maps suddenly show variations in spelling. Not gradual linguistic drift across generations. Abrupt changes within single lifetimes. A man born as Tartakov becomes Tartan. A woman recorded as Khazarian becomes Kharson. The modifications follow patterns suggesting coordination rather than individual choice. And here's what makes it significant. The families making these changes weren't random immigrants seeking better opportunities. Many were already established, property owners, skilled craftsmen, people with trades that suggested specialized knowledge, stonemasons, metallurgists, architectural surveyors, engineers, occupations that would have understood the buildings they inhabited better than anyone else. What did they know that required such complete reinvention? Genealogical research hits walls during this exact period. Family trees that trace clearly through centuries suddenly fragment in the 1880s. Documentation becomes sparse. Birth records contain inconsistencies. Marriage certificates show conflicting information about parents' origins. It's not the chaos of poor record keeping. It's the signature of deliberate obscurity. Some families preserved fragments, photographs tucked in attics showing relatives of unusual height, tools passed down through generations, massive wrenches and specialized instruments whose purpose no one remembers, letters written in scripts that don't match any standard language classification. These artifacts appear in estate sales labelled as curiosities, their significance lost because the context was intentionally destroyed. The linguistic evidence compounds the mystery. Certain surname roots appear across impossible distances with identical spelling. Names showing up in Central Asian records, Russian archives, and American immigration documents with no clear migration path connecting them. As if populations scattered rapidly, carrying only their names as identification markers. DNA analysis has started revealing uncomfortable truths. Families with supposedly straightforward European ancestry show genetic markers clustering in regions that don't match their documented origins, regions that correspond precisely to territories labelled Tartary on historical maps. The genetic record suggests populations moved or were displaced on scales never officially documented. Contemporary accounts from the period describe this indirectly. Newspaper editorials from the 1890s reference large-scale population movements without explaining their cause. Municipal records note sudden increases in residents from unspecified eastern territories. Census takers complained about difficulties categorizing certain groups who didn't fit established ethnic classifications. What catastrophe could scatter a population so thoroughly that within 2 generations their descendants wouldn't know their own origins? The architectural inheritance provides clues. Buildings attributed to 19th century construction contain foundation work requiring knowledge that supposedly didn't exist yet. Load calculations precise enough to support structures far heavier than anything placed on them. Acoustic engineering sophisticated enough that modern architects study these spaces, trying to understand how they achieved such properties. These weren't built by people learning as they went. They were built by people applying established principles, maintaining traditions, preserving techniques they'd inherited from somewhere else. And then it stopped. By 1920, the construction methods changed. Buildings became simpler, more standardized, less acoustically refined. As if the knowledge workers, the specialists who understood the old techniques, had either disappeared or chosen to stop demonstrating what they knew. Your family name might be more than simple identification. It might be a marker, a remnant of affiliation with something systematically erased. The spelling changes, the documentation gaps, the genetic anomalies, they're not administrative errors. They're evidence of people deliberately stepping away from a history that had become too dangerous to claim. The pattern extends beyond individual families. Entire communities show this signature. Towns with founding populations whose origins can't be clearly traced. Regions where architectural styles don't match surrounding areas. Places where local traditions preserve fragments of practices that don't connect to any acknowledged cultural source. Official history calls these anomalies local colour, regional variations, but when you map them, when you trace the connections, they align. They cluster in areas where Tartary maps showed population centres. They appear along routes that would have connected those territories. They concentrate in regions where massive construction projects from the 1800s still stand unexplained. The evidence suggests something far larger than we've been taught. Not a conspiracy requiring active suppression, but a collective forgetting. A cultural amnesia so complete that questioning it seems absurd. Because if Tartary represented an organised civilization, if the giants were its administrative class, if the architecture we inherited was built by people we've erased from history, then everything we think we know about the recent past collapses. Your surname isn't just a name, it's a thread connecting you to questions that were deliberately left unasked. The buildings around you aren't just old structures, they're evidence of knowledge we've forgotten how to read. And the family stories about name changes and lost origins aren't embarrassing gaps in genealogy. They're clues pointing toward a history we inherited without understanding what we received. The next time someone tells you their family name was changed at Ellis Island, listen more carefully to what they're not saying. Because beneath that convenient story, there might be a truth their ancestors decided was safer to bury. The buildings still stand, oversized and unexplained. The photographs still exist, showing people who shouldn't be possible. The DNA doesn't lie, revealing origins that contradict the official story. And somewhere in your family tree, there might be a name that was changed not to fit in, but to disconnect. Not to simplify, but to hide. The question isn't whether Tartary existed. The maps prove it did. The question is what happened to the people who lived there, why their descendants needed new identities, and what knowledge died with the names they abandoned. Your surname might be the last evidence of a civilization we were taught to forget. And now that you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The architecture remembers what the history books erased. The genetic markers tell stories the documents won't confirm. And your family name, whether changed or preserved, connects you to something far older and more sophisticated than anyone wants to acknowledge. That's not a theory. That's a trail of evidence leading back to a deliberately obscured past. And it's been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to ask why.